Some people treat belief like a precious heirloom, something handed down, never questioned, never let go. They hold it not because they chose it after careful thought, but because it was given to them before they even had a chance to choose. And when that kind of belief takes root early enough, no amount of debate, evidence, or logic can easily shake it loose. That's why you can't convert atheists, not because they're stubborn or arrogant, but because their lack of belief isn't built on emotion or tradition. It's built on the collapse of those things. When someone stops believing in gods, it's rarely because they simply changed their mind one day. It's usually the result of a long process of questioning, of peeling back layers of stories, customs, and inherited assumptions until nothing is left that requires faith. Once a person has reached that point, trying to convert them is like trying to sell water to someone who just learned how to dig their own well. Most religious conversions rely on emotion, fear, hope, belonging, guilt. They thrive on moments of vulnerability. People are converted when they're lost, lonely, or desperate for meaning. But once you stop seeing those emotions as evidence of anything supernatural, once you learn to recognize them as just human feelings, powerful but still human, that spell breaks. You can still feel awe, wonder, gratitude, without believing there's a divine hand behind it. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That's why trying to convert someone who has already walked through that realization doesn't work. You're not dealing with a lack of information. You're dealing with a different kind of understanding altogether. Atheists, by and large, have already heard the arguments for belief. Most were raised in religious homes, taught the stories, the doctrines, the promises. They know the claims. They just no longer find them convincing. It's often said that faith is a gift. But from another point of view, faith looks like something you give up when you grow comfortable with uncertainty. For many, that's what the journey out of belief really is. Not rebellion, not arrogance, but acceptance of not knowing. It's learning to live without easy answers, without invisible comfort, and without promises that can't be proven. And that's what makes conversion attempts so futile. You can't sell certainty to someone who has made peace with doubt. It's interesting to notice how differently both sides approach evidence. Religious arguments often begin with the conclusion that God exists, and then work backwards, fitting the facts around that belief. The non-believer starts with the facts and lets them lead wherever they lead, even if that means ending up with no God at all. That's not stubbornness. That's intellectual honesty. And once you get used to that method, to letting go of the need for a comforting answer, every supernatural claim starts to feel like a step backwards, even when believers appeal to personal experience, simply and aware. I felt God's presence. I've seen miracles. It's not persuasive to someone who understands how perception and emotion work. Human beings are meaning-making machines. We can turn random noise into messages, coincidences into destiny, sensations into proof. Once you realize how powerful the brain is at constructing belief, you stop mistaking those feelings for truth. There's also a psychological barrier that most apologists don't understand. When you've spent years unlearning a worldview, often one that dictated your morality, your identity, your purpose, you don't just slip back into it because someone quotes scripture or promises salvation. That's not just intellectually unconvincing. It's emotionally impossible. It would mean pretending to believe something you know deep down was built on fragile ground. In fact, most attempts to reconvert atheists end up reinforcing their disbelief. When someone argues that you should believe because of fear of hell, of punishment, of divine judgment, it only highlights how manipulative belief can be. When someone claims that without religion there's no morality, it reveals how shallow their understanding of ethics actually is. And when they say, you just haven't experienced God yet, they're ignoring the millions who once believed passionately and stopped, not because they lacked experience, but because experience stopped being enough. You can't convert atheists because most of them didn't stop believing out of ignorance or rebellion, and they stopped because they followed the evidence. And evidence doesn't bend to persuasion. There's also a deeper issue, the idea that faith itself is a virtue. To believe without proof is often seen as noble, but from a skeptical point of view, That's not virtue, that's surrender. It's giving up the responsibility to question. To someone who's chosen to live without that surrender, faith isn't something to aspire to, it's something to outgrow. That's not to say people who believe are foolish or lesser. Most are sincere, good-hearted individuals who genuinely find comfort in their beliefs. But sincerity isn't a pathway to truth. Billions of people have been equally sincere about completely different gods, moral systems, and revelations. Sincerity is just a measure of conviction, not accuracy. Once you understand that, sincerity loses its power as evidence. When someone says you must feel empty without faith, it misses the point entirely. The absence of belief doesn't create emptiness. It creates space for curiosity, for discovery, for a sense of wonder that isn't confined by dogma. When you stop pretending to know things you don't, the world doesn't shrink, it expands. Every question becomes an adventure again. Every moment becomes real in a way that's not filtered through expectation or supernatural interpretation. So when believers try to convert atheists, they're often using the same tools that once convinced them: emotional appeals, promises of meaning, threats of loss. But those tools don't work anymore because the person they're trying to reach no longer needs what those tools offer. The emotional structure that faith depends on, fear, longing, dependence, has already been dismantled. The mind that no longer relies on divine authority becomes its own compass. That doesn't mean it's infallible, just self-correcting. It learns, it adjusts, it grows. Religion often presents itself as a final answer. Skepticism is comfortable being a perpetual question, and that's something you can't convert back from. You can't unlearn how to think critically. You can't unknow how your mind constructs meaning. You can't go back to accepting miracles at face value once you understand how probability and bias work. And you can't make yourself believe in a God you no longer see as necessary to explain anything. Faith thrives on mystery, not curiosity, but the kind that stops asking questions. Atheism, or more precisely free thought, thrives on the opposite, the kind of curiosity that refuses to stop. That's the real divide, not between good and bad, or believer and non-believer, but between those who think questions threaten faith and those who think questions strengthen understanding. And that's why you can't convert atheists, not because they think they know everything, but because they've accepted that no one does. The moment someone reaches that realization and that not knowing is not a flaw but a starting point, the entire framework of faith begins to crumble. Religion depends on certainty. It offers definitive answers to impossible questions. What happens after death? Why we're here? What everything means? Those answers are emotionally satisfying, but intellectually fragile. Once you learn to live without them, you stop needing them altogether. And that's where the separation becomes permanent. You can't sell certainty to someone who's learned to question it. You can't promise eternal life to someone who values this one enough not to trade it for a story. You can't threaten hell to someone who no longer believes in one. Conversion loses all leverage the moment fear and reward stop working. It's often assumed that atheists lack faith, but that phrasing itself misses the point. It implies that faith is a default and disbelief is a deficiency. But for many, disbelief is the recovery of something, a return to intellectual integrity. It's the act of aligning your beliefs with the evidence, even when that evidence doesn't promise comfort. When you've spent time in that mindset, when you've built your worldview around reason instead of reassurance, you can't just flip it back like a light switch. When religious people debate atheists, they often assume there's a missing emotional piece that just needs to be filled. They'll say, you just need to open your heart, as if disbelief is caused by stubbornness or trauma. But for most, it's not an emotional wound, it's a logical conclusion. They've already opened their heart to reality. There's also a misunderstanding of what atheists actually reject. It's not just disbelief in gods, it's disbelief in the claims made about gods and the miracles, the revelations, the moral authority, and those claims fail the same tests that any other extraordinary claim would. If someone told you they could control the weather, or speak to the dead, or heal the blind through touch, you'd ask for evidence. The same standard applies to religion. The difference is, once you apply that standard consistently, faith can't survive it. Some religious people try a different tactic. They'll say, well, you have faith too. You have faith in science, faith in reason, but that's a false equivalence. Trusting a process that produces consistent, testable results isn't faith. It's confidence built on evidence. Faith asks you to believe without proof. Science asks you to believe because of proof. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction is what makes the gap unbridgeable. Conversion thrives on emotional dissonance, on creating a sense of moral or existential panic that only belief can resolve. But once someone recognizes that trick, it stops working. When you see that religion often manufactures the wound so it can sell the cure, you stop buying it. And here's the irony. Most atheists understand religion better than most believers do. And because they've studied it from both sides, they've read the holy books, listened to sermons, prayed the prayers, and then stepped back and asked, does this make sense? And they know the verses, the doctrines, the apologists' arguments. That's why conversion attempts feel so hollow. It's like watching someone try to sell you a movie you've already seen and you know how it ends. There's also a cognitive dissonance at play when believers try to convert non-believers. They'll say that their God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, yet somehow needs them to convince others. If an all-powerful being wanted everyone to believe, wouldn't it just make itself known clearly to everyone? The fact that it doesn't, that belief depends on geography, upbringing, and culture, is already a strong argument against the universality of faith. Look at the map of global religion. Where you're born almost always determines what you believe. A child born in Pakistan grows up Muslim, one in India grows up Hindu, one in Italy grows up Catholic. The pattern is too perfect to be divine, and it's cultural. And once you see that, conversion looks less like spiritual awakening and more like social conditioning. That's another reason atheists are so hard to convert. They've broken the pattern. They've stepped outside the cultural script and started asking how the story got written in the first place. When you realize that your God looks suspiciously like the people who first told you about it, you start to suspect that maybe it was them all along. And even when a believer tries to use philosophy or cosmology to argue for a creator, it rarely lands, because the question isn't whether something might have caused the universe. It's whether that cause has anything to do with the God of any particular religion. Even if the universe did have a cause, that doesn't automatically justify temples, priests, rituals, or moral codes. Jumping from something started the universe to my religion is true is a leap too far. Atheists tend to see that leap instantly. They've learned how often humans fill gaps in knowledge with stories and how those stories grow into belief systems that feel ancient and sacred. But started as guesses, myths once explained thunder, disease, and drought. Now we have weather science, medicine, and irrigation. The pattern keeps repeating. Religion claims a mystery. Science eventually explains it. And when that happens enough times, faith starts to look less like a source of truth and more like a placeholder for it. That's what makes conversion impossible. You can't convince someone to go back to using placeholders when they already understand the process of discovery. Even emotionally, religion loses its grip once you see its mechanisms. The promise of eternal life sounds comforting until you realize it devalues this one. The threat of hell stops working when you understand how fear shapes belief. The notion of divine love feels hollow when you notice how often it comes with conditions. Once those illusions break, no sermon can glue them back together. There's also a deeper moral independence that forms after disbelief. Many who leave religion discover that their sense of right and wrong didn't come from holy books. It came from empathy, reason, and shared human experience. When you start seeing morality as a human project, not a divine command, you stop needing gods to behave ethically. And once you understand that morality existed before and beyond religion, conversion arguments about moral decay lose all power. And that's another wall conversion can't climb. Because the threat of without God there's no morality sounds absurd to someone who's already lived decently, compassionately, and ethically without belief. You can't guilt someone into a faith that they've outgrown morally. The attempt to convert an atheist is, in a way, an attempt to reintroduce dependence on authority, on external validation, on ancient texts. But disbelief frees you from that. It hands responsibility back to the individual, not to be perfect, but to be honest, to act not because a deity commands it, but because it makes sense. It reduces harm. It builds trust. That's a harder standard, but also a more authentic one. And here's the subtle truth believers often miss. Atheists aren't closed-minded. They're just finished being persuaded by bad arguments. Most would happily reconsider if genuine evidence emerged, but that's the point. Evidence never does. And faith is the word religion uses to disguise that absence. Conversion relies on emotional certainty, but skepticism thrives on intellectual humility. And the two can't coexist. You can't ask someone to believe without question when their whole worldview is built on questioning. You can't invite them to stop thinking when thinking is what freed them. You can't convert atheists because they've already done the hardest conversion there is. From certainty to curiosity, that conversion from certainty to curiosity is the one that sticks. It's the one that changes not just what you believe, but how you believe. Once you've learned to question your own assumptions, even your most comforting ones, you can't return to blind acceptance. You become aware of the machinery behind belief, how stories are told, how authority is built, how repetition becomes conviction. Once you've seen those gears turning, it's like seeing backstage at a magic show. The trick never works on you again. And that's what frustrates so many who try to convert atheists. They assume disbelief is a kind of emptiness that just needs the right truth to fill it. But disbelief isn't empty. It's spacious. It's room for new questions, for constant revision, for genuine wonder that doesn't need to resolve into certainty. There's a beauty in saying, I don't know, and meaning it, because I don't know is the beginning of discovery, while God did it is the end of it. Many conversion attempts rest on a misunderstanding of what humans actually want. People think we crave certainty above all else, but what we really crave is meaning. Certainty is just one way of getting it, and not always the healthiest way. Meaning that depends on unquestionable beliefs is fragile. Lose the belief and the meaning collapses with it. But when your meaning comes from reality itself, from relationships, from creativity, from understanding, from being present, it doesn't vanish when stories are questioned. It grows stronger. That's another reason atheists can't be converted. They've already built meaning that doesn't depend on faith. They don't need to be told their lives matter because of divine purpose. They know their lives matter because they can choose what matters. They don't need heaven to feel peace. They find it in the finite. They don't need divine judgment to behave morally. They value the consequences of their actions in the here and now. When religion promises salvation, atheists see the bargain. Give up critical thought, surrender to authority, and in return, you'll never have to face uncertainty again. But uncertainty isn't a punishment. It's just that your reality being honest. It's what gives life its depth, its urgency, its truth. You can't convert someone away from honesty back into illusion once they've made peace with uncertainty. What's also worth noting is that conversion appeals often depend on moral insecurity. Believers might say, without faith, how do you know what's right and wrong? But that question itself reveals how dependent religion makes people on external rules. For someone who's learned to reason morally, right and wrong aren't dictated by divine decree. They're discovered through empathy, evidence, and shared human well-being. It's a living, self-correcting system. You don't need a commandment to know that kindness works and cruelty fails. So when a believer says, you can't have morality without God, what an atheist hears is, I can't trust myself to be moral without supervision. That's not a selling point. It's an admission that belief is a leash, one some people might still need, but others have learned to outgrow. There's also a cultural angle that's often overlooked. In many societies, religion is woven into identity so deeply that questioning it feels like betrayal. Families, communities, even the entire nations build themselves around shared myths. Leaving that framework takes courage. And once someone's done that, there's no going back. You can't rejoin the collective illusion after you've seen it from the outside. You can play along, maybe, but you can't truly believe again. Think about it this way. When someone realizes Santa Claus isn't real, they don't start believing in him again because a friend insists he must exist. They might remember the comfort of that belief, even miss it, but they know. And knowledge doesn't go in reverse. The same goes for God's miracles and divine plans. Once disbelief settles in, it's not rebellion, it's recognition. Conversion also struggles because it relies on the idea of choice. It assumes belief is something you can will into existence, but belief doesn't work that way. You can pretend to believe, you can act as if you do, but you can't genuinely force conviction. You either find something convincing or you don't. The brain can't unlearn what it's already reasoned through. You can't tell yourself to believe in a God any more than you can tell yourself to believe the sky's green. Belief isn't obedience, it's perception. That's why threats of punishment or promises of paradise fall flat. They might make someone act religious, but they can't make someone truly believe. Fear and hope can influence behavior, but not truth. You can scare a child into praying, but you can't scare them into genuine conviction. And atheists, by and large, have simply stopped pretending that conviction can be manufactured by pressure. And maybe that's the deepest point of all. Disbelief isn't defiance, it's honesty. It's admitting that we don't know everything and refusing to fill the gaps with comforting fiction. Now, that's not arrogance. That's humility in its purest form. To say I don't know is to stay open, to keep looking, to never settle for less than reality. Religious conversion tries to offer peace by closing the door on doubt. But doubt isn't the enemy of peace, it's the price of growth. The mind that doubts is the mind that learns. And a mind that's learned how to doubt well is a mind that can't be converted back. It's also worth noting that many atheists weren't persuaded out of belief by other people. They found their way through introspection, study, and experience, which means they're unlikely to be persuaded back by anyone else. You can't undo self-discovery with someone else's conviction. The more you understand how belief systems work, psychologically, sociologically, historically, the less magical they seem. You see how religions evolve, how doctrines adapt, how moral rules shift with time. You see how every eternal truth from the past eventually meets the same fate. It becomes metaphor, then myth, then memory. Once you see that cycle clearly, every new attempt at conversion feels like déjà vu. People often mistake disbelief for coldness, as if not believing in a God means not believing in anything, but that's not true. It just means believing in things that are real. People, love, knowledge, progress. It means putting faith not in the invisible, but in what can be built, understood, and shared. And that's something no preacher, no missionary, no argument can undo. You can't convert atheists, because what they have isn't just disbelief, it's conviction born from evidence, understanding, and courage. You can't talk someone out of that any more than you can talk someone out of gravity. The truth is, if you want to convert someone who doesn't believe, you'd have to do the impossible, make the unbelievable believable again. You'd have to make the supernatural verifiable, the eternal observable, the divine demonstrable. Until that happens, words are just words. You can't convert atheists because they've already learned the one thing religion can't survive, how to think without permission. And once someone learns to think without permission, and there's no going back. That's the real boundary between faith and skepticism. Religion often teaches people what to think. Rational inquiry teaches them how to think. And when someone crosses that line, when they stop asking, what am I supposed to believe? And start asking what's actually true, that's when conversion becomes impossible. It's not that atheists have closed minds, it's that their minds are open in a way that belief can't accommodate. They've traded the comfort of answers for the excitement of questions. They've replaced dogma with discovery. They don't need a final truth to feel whole. They understand that uncertainty isn't chaos. It's the natural state of an honest mind. Every religion depends on the idea that truth is already known, already revealed, already complete. But the moment you accept that knowledge is something we build, test, and revise, the need for revelation disappears. You stop waiting for answers from the sky and start looking for them in reality. You start valuing curiosity more than obedience. And once you've tasted that freedom, conversion feels like a cage. That's what believers often misunderstand. They think disbelief is a rejection of meaning, but it's actually a rejection of control. Control by institutions, by sacred texts, by self-appointed interpreters of divine will. To believe again would mean surrendering that autonomy, and most who've left it behind have no desire to return. They've learned to trust themselves, not because they think they're infallible, but because they know no one else is either. Religion offers the illusion of stability. It promises that no matter how chaotic the world becomes, there's a plan behind it all. But to someone who's accepted randomness and complexity as part of life, that promise feels hollow. The comfort it provides comes at the cost of truth, and that's a trade many are no longer willing to make. You can't convert atheists because they no longer crave the kind of certainty religion offers. They've realized that not all uncertainty is pain. Sometimes it's just honesty. Sometimes it's liberation. They've seen that mystery isn't something to fear, but something to explore. The unknown doesn't have to be filled with gods to be meaningful. It's meaningful because it's real. There's another layer to this, the emotional honesty of disbelief. As believers often talk about having a personal relationship with God, but to an atheist, that idea is as strange as having a personal relationship with a storybook character. It's not cynicism, it's just clarity. The emotional bond may feel real, but the object of that bond doesn't exist outside the mind. And when someone accepts that, they don't lose their capacity for love or wonder. They redirect it toward what actually exists: people, nature, ideas, experiences. The awe a believer feels in a church, an atheist can feel under the stars. The gratitude a believer expresses in prayer, an atheist can feel toward the improbability of being alive at all. The moral calling a believer finds in Scripture, an atheist can find in empathy and reason. The emotions are the same, only the interpretation changes. And once you understand that those feelings come from within, not above, the need for belief evaporates. That's the quiet revolution of disbelief, realizing that everything religion offers can be found without it, meaning purpose, morality, beauty, community. None of these require the supernatural. Once that truth settles in, conversion attempts start to sound like offers of a product you've already outgrown. And if you think about it, the very act of trying to convert someone reveals doubt on the believer's side. If faith were truly unshakable, it wouldn't need constant reinforcement. The fact that missionaries, apologists, and preachers dedicate their lives to convincing others shows that belief is fragile. Conviction that depends on validation from others isn't conviction. It's dependence. Atheists don't feel the same urgency to convert because disbelief isn't a team sport. There's no need to spread it, no eternal reward for convincing others. It's simply a conclusion about reality. You don't recruit people to gravity or evolution, you explain it, and the evidence does the rest. The difference is that religion can't rely on evidence. It relies on emotion, repetition, and social pressure. Without those, it fades. And that's why in modern societies where education and free inquiry thrive, religion naturally declines. Not because people are being led astray, but because access to information erodes the foundations of faith. Once people learn how myths form, how scriptures are edited, how doctrines evolve, the mystique disappears. Knowledge doesn't destroy belief, it just makes belief unnecessary. That's what atheists understand. You can't convert someone who doesn't need what you're selling. They don't need divine purpose to live ethically. They don't need cosmic surveillance to behave decently. They don't need invisible comfort to face mortality. They've learned to find strength in truth even when it's uncomfortable. And perhaps the most powerful thing disbelief gives, something conversion can't compete with, is authenticity. Living without pretending, saying what you actually think, accepting what you actually know, not having to defend stories you no longer believe or suppress doubts to fit in. That authenticity, once tasted, is addictive. You can't trade it back for belief without lying to yourself, and that's a price too high for most to pay. The moment someone stops needing belief to feel whole, they become unreachable by conversion, because conversion at its core preys on need, the need for belonging, for assurance, for meaning. But once you learn to create those things for yourself, you become immune. And that's the secret believers don't like to admit. Religion doesn't work on people who don't need it. It can't manufacture dependence once independence is learned. That's why most conversion efforts fail, and why the few that seem to succeed are often temporary. People may return to belief out of fear or grief, but deep down, the questions remain unanswered. Once the curtain has been pulled back, no sermon can hide it again. The truth is, you can't convert atheists because there's nothing to convert them to that they haven't already examined. They've read the scriptures, they've seen the rituals, they've studied the arguments, they've lived the belief, and they've walked away not out of ignorance but out of an understanding. You can't convert atheists because conversion depends on faith, and faith depends on not knowing too much. Once you really know how fragile belief is, how human its origins are, how predictable its evolution has been, you stop treating it as sacred. You start treating it as history, psychology, and sociology. You see gods as mirrors, not masters, and that kind of clarity can't be undone. It's not hostility that keeps atheists unconvinced. It's comprehension. They see the system from the inside and outside all at once. They've lived a belief and learned disbelief. And once both sides are visible, one becomes transparent. So when a believer says, "You just haven't found God yet," the response isn't anger, it's quiet understanding, because the atheist knows they did find belief once and they found their way out of it. You can't convert atheists because their disbelief isn't a rejection of faith. It's a reconciliation with reality. And once you've reconciled with reality, you stop needing anyone to rewrite it for you. That's the point many people misunderstand. Disbelief isn't bitterness toward religion or rebellion against morality. It's simply the decision to stop accepting comforting stories as truth, as growing comfortable with the idea that life doesn't need to be scripted to be meaningful. When someone leaves religion, they're not just rejecting a God, they're rejecting the idea that meaning must be handed down. They start writing it themselves. They stop living for the next world and start living for this one. And when that shift happens, conversion loses all traction. You can't threaten someone with eternity when they've learned to value time. You can't promise heaven to someone who already sees paradise in existence itself. The mistake many missionaries make is thinking atheists are spiritually broken. They believe disbelief is a wound that only faith can heal. But most atheists aren't bleeding, they're breathing. They're at peace with the uncertainty, with the impermanence, with the mystery that doesn't need resolution. Conversion attempts fail because they offer solutions to problems that don't exist anymore. When someone says, "You'll never find meaning without God," they're assuming meaning is something you find as if it's hidden somewhere waiting for you. But meaning isn't discovered, it's created. It's built out of relationships, knowledge, compassion, and experience. It grows as you grow, and that kind of meaning doesn't require permission from the divine. That's why conversion rhetoric sounds hollow to non-believers. It tries to sell an outdated model of purpose. It promises answers that stop curiosity instead of nurturing it. It asks for submission in exchange for security. But a mind that has learned to think freely doesn't want safety at the cost of truth. Once you've built your life around reality as it is, myths, no matter how beautiful, feel like a step backward. Belief thrives on emotional shortcuts. It tells you the world is simple, that good and evil are clear, that suffering has a reason, that you are special and watched over. But reality is complicated, messy, indifferent, beautiful, fleeting, and learning to love that complexity is one of the deepest forms of peace there is. Once someone reaches that point, conversion isn't just ineffective, it's irrelevant. There's also something liberating about the honesty of disbelief. You stop pretending to know things you don't. You stop making excuses for contradictions. You stop defending ideas that crumble under scrutiny. That freedom of thought once earned becomes precious. You guard it the way others guard faith, because it's not built on promises, it's built on truth, however uncertain that truth might be. Atheists aren't unreachable because they're arrogant. They're unreachable because they've outgrown the illusion that faith is the only path to meaning. They've replaced belief with understanding, submission with curiosity, dogma with dialogue. You can't convert someone back into a worldview that depends on not asking the questions they've already asked, and yet the attempts continue. Missionaries still knock on doors, apologists still debate, preachers still plead from pulpits. They keep trying to replant a seed that only grows in darkness, forgetting that once light has hit it, once someone has seen clearly, it doesn't sprout anymore. The soil has changed. The mind has changed. The person has changed. And that change is irreversible. It's not just intellectual, it's emotional, psychological, even moral. Because disbelief isn't just about gods, it's about autonomy. It's about owning your thoughts, your values, your decisions. To go back would mean surrendering that ownership. And most people who've gained it wouldn't trade it for the comfort of belonging. That's another thing believers often underestimate. The strength of finding community outside religion. They think atheists are isolated, adrift, lonely, but many find deeper connection through shared humanity instead of shared belief. When compassion isn't filtered through doctrine, it becomes more genuine, and when morality isn't defined by authority, it becomes more personal. You act kindly because it's right, not because it's required, and that kind of ethics doesn't need conversion, it's self-sustaining. You can't convert atheists because they've learned to see belief systems as human creations, and that realization is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals how small we are in the cosmos, and empowering because it shows that meaning, morality, and beauty are ours to create. The further someone travels down that path, the less persuasive supernatural claims become. The stories that once felt sacred start to look symbolic. The miracles that once seemed profound start to look explainable. The mysteries that once required God start to unfold under the lens of science, and with every layer of understanding, faith loses one of its hiding places. There was a time when gods lived in the thunder, the ocean, the sky. Then they retreated into the gaps science hadn't yet filled, and now, as the knowledge expands, they retreat again into hearts, into metaphors, into abstractions so vague they can't be tested. But even there, disbelief follows, asking simple questions. What do you mean by God? What evidence do you have? Why should I believe? And those questions, those quiet, persistent, rational questions are what make conversion impossible, because belief relies on stopping them while skepticism relies on never stopping them. You can't convert atheists because conversion is about closing the door, and atheism is about leaving it open. Even the concept of faith itself begins to feel foreign after a while. The idea that believing without evidence is somehow virtuous becomes difficult to take seriously. To someone who values honesty, claiming certainty about the unknowable feels dishonest, even disrespectful to truth itself. It's not cynicism, it's integrity. It's saying, I don't know, and meaning it. So when someone tries to convert an atheist, they're not confronting ignorance, they're confronting integrity. And integrity doesn't bend to pressure. It doesn't respond to fear or flattery. It stands quietly in the face of uncertainty and says, show me. And that's where conversion fails every time, because belief says, trust me, and disbelief says, prove it. Until those two mindsets can meet on the same terms, until faith can survive in the light of evidence, the conversation will always end in the same place, with one side saying, you just have to believe, and the other saying, that's not good enough, and it never will be. You can't convert atheists because they've stopped mistaking comfort for truth. And once you stop doing that, once you see that comfort and truth don't always live in the same place, you stop chasing the former at the expense of the latter. You start building your peace out of understanding, not illusion, and that kind of peace can't be converted away. At that point, conversion becomes not just impossible, but unnecessary. Once someone learns to live honestly within uncertainty, they no longer need belief to soothe them. They find meaning in the moment, not in promises. They find purpose in creation, not command. They find awe in reality itself, in stars that don't need names, in lives that don't need eternity, in kindness that doesn't need reward. That's something religion often underestimates, and the beauty of meaning that ends. The idea that something can matter because it's temporary, that love, joy, and compassion are precious precisely because they're fleeting. You don't need forever to make life worth living. You just need now. And when you live like that, threats of hell and promises of heaven lose their grip. They start to feel like distractions from the only existence we actually know we have. You can't convert someone back into worrying about eternity once they've learned to value reality as it is. For those who leave faith, the moment of clarity often comes quietly, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in a slow realization that belief simply stopped fitting. The old answers stopped answering. The stories stopped inspiring. The rituals stopped resonating. It's not a sudden rejection, but a gradual shedding. And by the time it's complete, there's no need to reject anything anymore. It's just gone. That's why conversion feels absurd from the outside. It's like asking someone to start believing in astrology after studying astronomy. The constellations are still beautiful, but you understand what they really are now. You can appreciate the stories without mistaking them for truth. Many who try to reconvert atheists think they're saving them from despair. They imagine that without belief, life must feel cold and meaningless, but that's only true if your sense of meaning depends on external validation. If you've learned to create it yourself, life without belief feels not empty, but honest. The world becomes enough. And honesty is what faith can't compete with, because honesty doesn't promise perfection. It promises reality. And reality, though imperfect, has something faith never will: authenticity. When you've built your understanding on that foundation, every religious argument starts to sound off key. When someone says, you just have to believe, so it translates to stop thinking. When someone says, God has a plan, it translates to don't question. And once you hear those translations clearly, you can't unhear them. It's not hostility that makes atheists unconvertible. It's fluency. They've learned the language of belief and can see through its metaphors. They understand why people believe, how belief functions, what needs it serves. They empathize, but they no longer participate. You can't convince someone to rejoin a play when they already know it's a play. And the irony is, many atheists would love to be proven wrong. They'd gladly accept a God if the evidence were there. They're not closed to the idea. They're just waiting for something more than words. That's what makes the charge of stubbornness so misplaced. They're not rejecting faith out of pride. They're rejecting it out of principle. They've learned that believing something just because you want it to be true doesn't make it true. And once you hold yourself to that standard, you stop accepting claims without evidence, no matter how comforting. That's not cynicism. That's discipline. And discipline doesn't yield to persuasion. It doesn't crumble under emotion. It doesn't bend because of fear. It's steady, sometimes quiet, sometimes firm, but always grounded. And that's why conversion doesn't land. It's like trying to sell superstition to a scientist. The methods don't align. If you tell someone who values evidence that belief requires none, you've already lost the argument. If you tell someone who values reality that truth lies beyond it, you've already admitted defeat. The conversation ends before it begins. That's not arrogance, it's coherence. The worldview that disbelief builds is self-consistent. It doesn't need miracles to function, it doesn't collapse under scrutiny, and it doesn't rely on suspension of doubt. That makes it resilient, not immune to new information, but immune to manipulation. And maybe that's what religion fears most, not disbelief itself, but immunity. When people stop being persuadable by emotional appeal, the entire machinery of faith loses its power. It stops being able to recruit, to guilt, to control. The spell breaks. Atheists, in that sense, aren't fighting belief. They're simply free from it. And you can't convert freedom. You can only replace it with submission. But once someone's lived without the chains, they recognize them immediately when offered back. The truth is, belief is fragile because it depends on agreement. It needs to be echoed, reinforced, shared. Disbelief doesn't. It can stand alone in silence and still be whole. That's why the world can be full of believers, and yet a single skeptic still threatens the system. One person refusing to play along exposes the illusion that faith is universal. That's what conversion tries to fix, the discomfort of knowing that doubt exists. But doubt isn't a virus, it's a sign of life. It means the mind is still working. And once someone's mind has awakened like that, you can't put it back to sleep. You can soothe it, distract it, even scare it, but you can't undo awareness. Awareness, once earned, stays. You can't convert atheists because conversion requires forgetting, and they've already learned too much. They've learned that truth doesn't need worship, that morality doesn't need commandments, that love doesn't need divine endorsement, that meaning doesn't need eternity, that peace doesn't need permission. They've learned that belief without evidence isn't humility, it's negligence. And that doubt isn't weakness, it's responsibility. And once you understand those things, you stop being afraid of what you don't know. You stop needing invisible answers. You stop being persuadable by old promises. You stop mistaking belief for virtue. You simply live fully, consciously, rationally, and with open eyes. And that's what makes atheists unconvertible. Because once you've chosen to see clearly, the world itself becomes enough. No gods required,